everyone, it's Angela with Broadhead Memorial Public Library back with another episode of Have You Heard? It's an exciting day because we are starting a new book. Our next book is actually a short story by Roald Dahl, who we have already read one book of, but this book is one that probably not very many people have heard. It is Esio Trot. And again, this is by Roald Dahl with illustrations by Quentin Blake. And we do want to thank Penguin Random House for allowing us to share the story with you this summer. So, if you've never heard of this book before, it is about some tortoises that live in an apartment building. So let's start reading. I think it's pretty short. It's only, it's only probably about 80 pages long. So I think we'll probably read half today and half tomorrow. And then we'll start a new book on Thursday. Okay, let's go. So here are some of the characters in the book. Mr. Hoppy, who is a man. Alfie, who is a turtle. The pet shop owner. And Mrs. Silver. And then this contraption right here is important. Let's see if you can see it. Hopefully the sun's not too bright. That is the tortoise catcher. All right, so let's start. Esio Trot. Mr. Hoppy lived in a small flat high up in a tall concrete building. He lived alone. He had always been a lonely man, and now that he was retired from work, he was more lonely than ever. There were two loves in Mr. Hoppy's life. One were the flowers he grew on his balcony. They grew in pots and tubs and baskets, and in summer the little balcony became a riot of color. Mr. Hoppy's second love was a secret he kept entirely to himself. The balcony immediately below Mr. Hoppy's jutted out a good bit further from the building than his own, so Mr. Hoppy always had a fine view of what was going on down there. This balcony belonged to an attractive middle-aged lady called Mrs. Silver. Mrs. Silver was a widow who also lived alone, and although she didn't know it, it was she who was the object of Mr. Hoppy's secret love. He had loved her from his balcony for many years, but he was a very shy man, and he had never been able to bring himself to give her even the smallest hint of his love. Every morning Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver exchanged polite conversation, the one looking down from above, the other looking up, but that was as far as it ever went. The distance between their balconies may not have been more than a few yards, but to Mr. Hoppy it seemed like a million miles. He longed to invite Mrs. Silver up for a cup of tea and a biscuit, but every time he was about to form the words on his lips, his courage failed him. As I said, he was a very, very shy man. And there's a picture of their balconies. So Mr. Hoppy's is up here with all the plants, and this is Mrs. Silver's. Oh, if only, he kept telling himself, if only he could do something tremendous like saving her life or rescuing her from a gang of armed thugs. If only he could perform some great feat that would make him a hero in her eyes. If only. The trouble with Mrs. Silver was that she gave all her love to somebody else, and that somebody was a small tortoise called Alfie. Every day when Mr. Hoppy looked over his balcony and saw Mrs. Silver whispering endearments into Alfie and stroking his shell, he felt absurdly jealous. He wouldn't even have minded becoming a tortoise himself if it meant Mrs. Silver stroking his shell each morning and whispering endearments to him. Alfie had been with Mrs. Silver for years, and he lived on her balcony summer and winter. Planks had been placed around the sides of the balcony so that Alfie could walk about without toppling over the edge. And in one corner there was a little house to keep Alfie warm. When the colder weather came along in November, Mrs. Silver would fill Alfie's house with dry hay, and the tortoise would crawl in there and bury himself deep under the hay and go to sleep for months on end without food or water. There's this little house. This is called hibernating. In early spring, when Alfie felt the warmer weather through his shell, he would wake up and crawl very slowly out of his house onto the balcony, and Mrs. Silver would clap her hands with joy and cry out, "Welcome back, my darling one! Oh, how I have missed you!" It was at times like these that Mr. Hoppy wished more than ever that he could change places with Alfie and become a tortoise. Now, we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail, watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking well this morning." "Isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face gazing up into his, he thought for the 1000th time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. "I do so wish he'd grow a little faster," Mrs. Silver was saying. "Every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing." "What does he weigh now?" Mr. Hoppy asked her. "Just 13 ounces," Mrs. Silver answered. "About as much as a grapefruit." "Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers," Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, "but they can live for 100 years. "I know that," Mrs. Silver said, "but I do so wish he would grow just a little bit bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow." "He seems just fine as he is," Mr. Hoppy said. "No, he's not just fine," Mrs. Silver cried. "Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up." "You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you?" Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea rushed into his head. "Of course I would," Mrs. Silver cried. "I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were able to see those, he'd turn green with envy." Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here surely was his big chance. "Grab it," he told himself. "Grab it quick." "Mrs. Silver," he said, "I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's really what you want." "You do?" she cried. "Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things?" "I worked in North Africa once," Mr. Hoppy said. "That's where all these tortoises in England come from, and the Bedouin tribesmen told me a secret." "Tell me," cried Mrs. Silver. "I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life." When he heard the words, "your slave for life," a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. "Wait there," he said. "I'll have to go in and write something down for you." A couple of minutes later, Mr. Hoppy was back on the balcony with a sheet of paper in his hand. "I'm going to lower it to you on a bit of string," he said, "or it might blow away. Here it comes." Mrs. Silver caught the paper and held it up in front of her. This is what she read. Esio Trot, Teg regib, Emog no, Esio Trot, Werg poo, Fup poo, Toots poo, Gnurps poo, Wolb poo, Lose poo, Egrog, Elsglug, Foots, Plug, Tup no taff, Esio Trot, Tup no taff, Tegno, Elbog, Doof. That's really what it says. I don't know if you can see it. "What What does it mean? She asked. It's in another language. It's tortoise language, Mr. Hoppy said. Tortoises are very backwards creatures. Therefore, they can only understand words that are written backwards. That's obvious, isn't it? I suppose so, Mrs. Silver said, bewildered. Esio Trot is simply tortoise spelled backwards, Mr. Hoppy said. Look at it. Well, so it is, Mrs. Silver said. The other words are spelled backwards too, Mr. Hoppy said. If you turn them around into human language, they simply say, Tortoise, tortoise, get bigger, bigger. Come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up, gorge, guzzle, stuff, gulp. Put on fat, tortoise, put on fat. Get on, gobble food. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with tortoises. Now what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out loud in tortoise language. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expression into it when you say it to Alfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mrs. Silver said. I'll try anything. Of course I will. But I can't believe it will work. You wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. Your slave for life? He kept repeating to himself. What bliss! Excuse me. But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there's not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the color of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more, but he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet shop owners told him. That's all they need, and a bowl of water. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. Can you imagine having 140 tortoises at your house? Where would you put all of them? He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it, but it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. What an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or 2. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down the inside of the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to the handle and the other end of the tube. It was very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Here's a picture of him in his workshop, and there is a picture of, what did we call it in the front? The tortoise catcher. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony, armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony rails and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You're about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up to his own balcony. It was easy. There's some pictures. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find the one that first of all had the same color shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But, you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the right tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales. No more, no less. When he had gotten it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 to the balcony and gripped it into the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it on to Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside some nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out on her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling," she cried out. "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked up the tortoise and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper, "Esio Trot, Esio Trot, Teg Regib Regib, Emak no Esio Trot, Werg Poo, Foof Poo, Tooz Poo, Nips Poo, Wolb Poo, Lose Poo, Egrog, Elsglug, Foots, Plug, Tup no Taff Esio Trot, Tup no Taff, Tegno, a bog doof. All right. Well, I think we will stop there for today, but we will be back tomorrow to finish the rest of Esio Trot. If you are participating in our summer reading program, you can go and jot 20 minutes of reading time down tomorrow. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it below, and you can also follow our page to get notifications when we post new videos. All right, well, everyone have a fantastic day, and I'll see you tomorrow with the rest of Esio Trot. Bye.